Daniel grabbed the TV remote control off of the CD beside him and stabbed at the mute button. The newsreader fell silent and continued to mouth the evening's headlines wordlessly. Daniel glared at the baby-safe intercom that sat on the sideboard. He was sure he heard the baby stir. He strained his ears, listening. He heard the rain against the conservatory roof. He heard the wind whistling over the chimney. He heard the constant hum of the heater in the bathroom, where his wife, Caroline, was having a bath. A bead of sweat ran down his temple, down his face. He could hear the baby softly gurgling to itself. Daniel gave the newsreader his voice back and turned the volume up slightly. He felt sweat run down his side under his dressing gown, and a chill passed through him. He took a swig of the lager bottle he cradled in his hand and slid it down his throat like ice. He shivered again. The baby let out a cry, a troubled yelp that had a slightly static quality to it as it came from the intercom. Daniel thought of unplugging it, but then thought better of it. He had done that once before, and Caroline had yelled at him. She'd really lost her temper, sobbing and crying and screaming. He left the intercom on, but turned the fire up an extra bar. Despite the sweat that leaked out of his skin, Daniel felt chilled to the bone. He sat back in his place on the CD and heard a high-pitched squeak. Standing back up, he looked at the cushion he'd just sat on and pulled out a toy that made the noise. It was a rubber giraffe that squeaked when you squeezed it. He tossed it into Joshua's toy box and sat down again. The baby let out another cry. Daniel glared at the intercom. There was another cry, and then a sob. Daniel drank some Carlsberg. The baby started to cry. Daniel felt sick. The crying coming from the intercom was shrill and piercing. He turned the volume up even further on the TV. The weatherman was smiling like an idiot now, while he told of the gales of rain, sleet, and snow that were headed for the area. Daniel finished his beer. The baby's cry started to sound more desperate, more anxious. Daniel went into the kitchen, and after dropping an empty beer bottle into the bin, he took another from the fridge. He stood in the kitchen for a while after closing the fridge door. Sweat ran from under his arm and down his face, yet he felt cold. He walked back into the living room. Joshua was still crying, screaming almost. Daniel knew he should go to the baby's room, but he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to go into the hallway, up the stairs, open the door with little Joshua's room sign. He couldn't do it. He sat down with his beer and watched the sports news. He could hardly hear what the reporter was saying. Joshua's screaming was too loud now. He wailed and screamed, wave after wave of piercing noise coming from the intercom. Sweat ran down Daniel's body. Shivers racked him as he tried to ignore the baby and listen to the football results. Joshua screamed and cried. Daniel sweated and shivered. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to turn the intercom off. Caroline walked into the room just before Daniel had time to stand up. She wore a dressing gown and one of those bathroom towels tied up in a bundle on the top of her head. She glared at Daniel fiercely. "Can't you hear that?" snapped Caroline, pointing at the intercom. "Are you deaf? He's screaming, for God's sake." Daniel just looked at her. Tears welled up in his eyes. "You could have gone up to him, Daniel. You're his father, you know. It shouldn't have to be all up to me." The baby's screaming continued. Tears started to roll down Daniel's cheek, and he whimpered. "I can't." Caroline gave him another severe glance, and then she was out in the hall. Daniel jumped to his feet. "Wait," he gasped as he followed her out of the living room. She stomped up the stairs, and as Daniel started up them, he experienced a strange sensation. Joshua's screaming came from the upstairs and from the intercom on the sideboard in the living room at the same time. It was a strange, real-life stereo, and he went dizzy. He tried to catch up with Caroline. At the top of the stairs, she walked straight through the door marked Joshua's room without any hesitation. He heard her softly cooing. The screamings halted, slightly, then proceeded, but quieter than before. Daniel reached the top of the stairs and stood in the doorway, watching his wife sat in the rocking chair. She was softly saying, "It's okay, honey bunny. Mommy's here. I'm here. You're all right now." The icy cold of the room chilled Daniel straight to the bone and made the hair on his arms bristle up, but Caroline didn't seem to notice. Daniel looked at the empty cot and started to sob. Caroline continued to talk softly to her empty arms, held as if cradling an infant, her breath making a mist in front of her, the sobbing of the baby that surrounded them, the sobbing that came from everywhere in the room, but from nowhere in particular, became quieter and sleepier. Daniel sobbed into his hands, then slumped down on his knees and cried in despair as Caroline talked to the baby that was no longer there. He remembered little Josh's beautiful hands, his tiny feet and beautiful ears. And he remembered the doctor saying that cot death was just one of those horrible but unavoidable things that happen. There was nothing that could be done, and it was so sad. Daniel sobbed into his hands as Caroline talked into the empty room and her empty arms. The baby's cries softened to just a gurgle again.